Egypt is a land of hidden treasures, buried secrets. Today, Egyptologists are still trying to unravel its mysteries. Who is unknown man E, entombed with the bodies of Egypt's greatest pharaohs? His face contorted as if screaming. Was he the disgraced son of a pharaoh or a foreign prince? Can a modern forensic investigation finally identify the mummy, known as the Screaming Man? The Cairo Museum, home of many of the most famous finds in Egyptian archaeology. Tucked high up on a forgotten shelf lies the coffin of unknown man E, the Screaming Man. Today, his coffin is being brought down because after 100 years, he's going to undergo a thorough scientific examination. His identity has been a matter of speculation ever since his discovery in 1881. It was a team of Victorian Egyptologists who first unwrapped the mummy. When they removed the last of the bandages, this is what they saw. Generations of scholars have searched for ways of explaining what happened to this individual. Why his face appears to be caught in a scream. Now, a new team of scientists is taking up the challenge. Dr. Zahi Hawass is Egypt's most senior archaeologist. For the first time, he's given permission for the mummy to be CT scanned.
You see this man sitting at the Cairo Museum waiting for people to reveal his mystery. Then it was really so important for me to be involved in this search, to find out who is this man.
By letting us see beneath the mummy's skin, the scanning process may reveal something about who he was and how he died. The scan data will then pass to Caroline Wilkinson, a facial anthropologist. She will work from a virtual 3D model of the skull to recreate the Screaming Man's face as it was in life. The aim is to weigh what these modern procedures reveal against the theories that have been developed during 120 years of speculation. During that time, little has emerged in the way of new evidence. The first scientific examination took place in 1886. It was performed by a team of 3, Gaston Maspero, the head of the Antiquities Service, a physician named Fouquet, and a chemist named Matthey. Egyptologist Dylan Bickerstaff has studied the work. He's been fascinated by the case for more than 10 years.
Fouquet and Maspero both had some experience of examining mummies before and really knew what a mummy should look like under normal circumstances, but they'd never seen anything quite like the mummy of unknown man E. This is what first struck the observers. His mouth wide open, eyes closed, nostrils flared, apparently screaming.
This museum in Luxor is dedicated to mummification, a process which, over the centuries, the Egyptians refined into an art. Since a big part of what makes unknown man E different is the way in which he was mummified, coming here may produce some answers. The records from the Victorian autopsy make it clear that when the examining team unwrapped unknown man E, they didn't find what they expected. Traditionally, the process of making a mummy followed a number of formal, ritualized steps.
This is the most important tool that was used for mummification. This was stuck up the left nostril, and then you jab around and make the brain soft and squidgy, and then using something similar to this with a hook in the end, you'd whirl it around a bit and then tease out the brain from the nostrils. Next part was to take a sharp knife, and this was used to make a cut in the left side of the body. And then the embalmer would stick his hand in and pull out the lungs, the liver, the intestines, and the stomach.
A body begins to decompose from the inside. Removing the internal organs, evisceration, was a key part of the mummification process. But when Dr. Fouquet first examined Unknown Man E, he believed he saw the organs intact and still in the abdomen. If he's correct, this fact alone makes the Screaming Man's mummy highly unusual. At first glance, however, it does display the most common feature of an Egyptian mummy. The flesh is preserved.
This white powder is what really makes mummy. This is natron, and it's basically a mixture of salt and baking soda, and you find it at the edges of lakes, and this is what you use to make mummy, because they desiccate and they also defat, and this is what you want in a corpse if it's going to survive forever.
Ordinarily, the business of wrapping the body only took place after the drying process was complete. This could sometimes last as long as 40 days. But something very different appears to have happened here. It seems this body was not dried out in that manner. Instead, the Victorian autopsy noted it had been covered in a thick white paste.
This plastering made of natron and quicklime is a very unusual technique, and it was one of the things which so disturbed the observers when they first unwrapped him.
Although the presence of natron was to be expected, the presence of quicklime was not. Its use in this way to embalm a body is simply unheard of in the Egyptian tradition. This wasn't the only strange thing about the Screaming Man. The manner of his burial was unusual in other ways and seems full of contradictions. His coffin was made from expensive cedar wood, but it was blank, totally unadorned. In Egyptian theology, a man couldn't enter the afterlife without his name. So there's something disturbing about the fact that he was left anonymous. Next, the Victorian examiners saw that the body had been deliberately preserved. That indicates respect and status. But they also saw that it had been covered with the skin of a sheep or a goat. In ancient times, this may have symbolized impurity. It's clear that the Victorian examiners were shocked by what they found. Before long, they came up with a dramatic theory to explain it. Maspero became convinced that not only was the Screaming Man royal, but that he had suffered a violent death. In the city of Cairo, a team of scientists is trying to find out the truth about an unidentified mummy known as Unknown Man E, the Screaming Man. They want to update the information from the first autopsy performed on the body more than a century ago. Maspero, the man in charge, believed the cause of death was poisoning. As if this weren't dramatic enough, Maspero also came to believe that this anonymous mummy was a member of the ancient Egyptian royal family. His theory stems from a dramatic find more than 300 miles south of Cairo, in a place known as Deir al-Bakhri. This is the place where the coffin of Unknown Man E was found. Egyptologist Peter Brand is anxious to see it for himself. At this secluded site, a vertical shaft, its entrance obscured from view, leads to one of the greatest finds in Egyptology. Despite its importance, the site isn't visited by tourists. It's normally sealed behind a brick wall. The shaft drops 45 feet. In 1881, the first Antilles official to come down here was met with the sight of 40 mummies.
Wow, this is absolutely incredible.
Unknown Man E was one of them, but the official paid him little attention. The tomb's other occupants seemed far more exciting.
What he actually discovered was very, very famous pharaohs. He could hardly believe it. There was Ramses II, arguably the most famous pharaoh of all time, Seti I, his father, Tutmosis III, the conqueror pharaoh. These were the really big names in ancient Egyptian history.
This corridor goes on forever.
The cache is an impressive feat of engineering, but its simplicity and bare walls suggest that this was something other than a typical tomb. The mummy of every pharaoh found here would originally have been buried elsewhere in the Valley of the Kings. The priests of ancient Egypt moved them here in an attempt to protect them.
We know that at the end of the Ramesside period, tomb robbing had gone from a small surreptitious activity to a national industry in this part of Egypt and Thebes. People were openly roving around at night, robbing royal tombs. And eventually, some of the high priests realized that the royal mummies themselves were in danger of being destroyed.
So they were moved here and stripped of anything of value. The plan was they'd be safe if there was nothing left worth stealing. The one thing they did keep was the possession most valuable to any ancient Egyptian, his name. Most of the coffins bear a name, carefully inscribed. Because a body with no inscription had no identity, it couldn't reach the afterlife. There are, however, no identifying marks on unknown man E. And yet, with no inscription, the exalted company he kept in death can suggest only one thing, that he was one of them.
We know from the mummies that are labeled, they are all members of the royal family, kings, princes, and princesses. But almost certainly he was somebody very important, probably a member of the royal family. If not a king, then a prince.
Someone went to great lengths to preserve unknown man E. Yet with his name gone, he was denied something deemed essential to him in the next life. A strange oversight if he were a member of the royal family. Lecturer and author Susan Redford travels to Medinet Habu. She's looking for traces of a disgraced Egyptian prince who some believe could be unknown man E. This was the palace of Ramses III. Later, it was a temple to him. The walls here are covered in depictions of Ramses as a courageous and powerful ruler. Ramses III is often referred to as the last great pharaoh of Egypt. Yet a chance find made in the early 1800s casts a shadow over his reign. This is a copy of a papyrus scroll. It's extraordinary evidence of a scandal which took place at the end of Ramses' reign.
This is the actual court transcripts of trials of a treasonous conspiracy against the pharaoh, Ramses III. And we know for a fact that this conspiracy was hatched by the women of the royal harem.
The royal harem was a group of women attached to the king's household. They were the wives and lovers of Ramses III. Being a member of the harem brought with it comfort and status, and it seems the women wanted for nothing except power. The papyrus alleges a palace coup was orchestrated by a woman called Tea. She planned to assassinate Ramses and replace him with her son, Prince Pentuer. At the time of the conspiracy, we know Ramses' chief wife was called Isis, and therefore her son, Prince Ramses, was the heir apparent. The line of succession in ancient Egypt was thought to be divinely ordained. It was meant to be clear and beyond dispute. So historians have never been able to explain why Tea, just one of the king's many wives, thought she could decide who wore the crown. Susan's answer is that Tea was no lowly concubine.
The women of the royal harem and also high-ranking men of Ramses' cabinet were willing to follow Tea's lead and support her in her scheme against the throne. She could have been no other than a queen of Egypt.
Susan theorizes that if Tea were confident the people would accept her son as ruler, he must have had some legitimate claim to the throne.
There's one scenario that makes sense to me. You have a chief queen. Her name is Tea. She is replaced by a younger woman, Isis, and a bitter rivalry ensues.
Though the theory seems logical, the papyrus is the only evidence that mentions Pentawere by name, and it doesn't talk about his rank. Nevertheless, Susan believes historians have overlooked other clues to Pentaware's status.
Here on the walls of the small backroom chapel is an intriguing relief. What we have here is 2 rows of princes bringing in offerings to their father, Ramses III, seated at right.
The princes appear in order of seniority, with the younger children of the king to the rear and 2 older princes at the front. High-ranking military titles are attached to these 2 figures, confirming their status as elder sons.
The bottom prince is called the Great Overseer of the Army, which is a title that is accorded to the heir apparent, the next in line.
From this, we can identify the figure as the Crown Prince Ramses.
However, the figure at the top, identical, obviously the equivalent in seniority with the Crown Prince himself, is entitled Crown Prince and Commander-in-Chief of Elite Foot Soldiers.
The norm in ancient Egypt was to make the hierarchy clear, to have an undisputed heir in place. But setting these men up as equals also made them rivals. Prince Ramses went on to become pharaoh. The name and titles of the figure at the top have never been found anywhere else.
So we're left to wonder, who is this prince? I can think of no other than the disgraced Pentawere.
It's known that Ramses was dead by the time the trials took place. The papyrus doesn't say whether the plotters had succeeded in killing the pharaoh. But by planning such a coup, they had committed high treason.
The plot was uncovered very quickly, and the perpetrators apprehended, and they were immediately brought to trial. They were arraigned before a panel of 12 judges, and they were found guilty, and they were executed.
The crucial fact is that, according to the papyrus, Pentawere may have been spared this fate. Perhaps in deference to his royal blood, he was allowed to commit suicide. Susan believes Pentawere could be Unknown Man E. But the theory has been around for a while. It was first suggested in the original autopsy in 1886. But if Unknown Man E and the disgraced prince are one and the same person, his penance didn't end with his suicide. The manner of his burial might have been considered the greatest punishment of all. Is the evidence starting to suggest that he was cursed, that someone tried to damn the screaming man? The mummy known as Unknown Man E is being prepared for a CT scan machine at Cairo Museum. The stretcher that carries him must be walked through the crowds of visitors that fill the museum. The mummy is roughly 3,000 years old, and every precaution has been taken to protect him from the light, heat, and humidity of the city. The CT scan will allow experts to see inside the mummy and, for the first time, build a complete physical picture of this man. The hope is that the examination will offer some clues as to who he was and how he died. By Egyptian standards, the screaming man is a highly unusual mummy. We know that ordinarily, mummification was carried out according to clearly defined routines and religious principles. The goal was to prepare the body for the next world.
Reaching the afterlife to the ancient Egyptians was incredibly important because this is where they were going to spend their immortal life. So they did everything they could in order to assure that that passage would be safe.
Melinda Hartwig is an expert in interpreting the artwork of ancient Egyptian tombs. Decoding these inscriptions is key to understanding the journey that Screaming Man could have expected to make, the journey into the afterlife. The Egyptians didn't consider a tomb to be the final resting place, but instead the starting point of a physical journey which began after death.
We're here inside of the burial chamber of Ramses VI. Now, obviously, a royal burial chamber is different than a non-royal burial chamber, and you can see the extent that they went to make sure that everything was here that was needed. What happens is that the door was shut to the tomb, and the mummy inside of the coffins, inside of the sarcophagus, rose up, and the journey begins.
The transition to the afterlife was so perilous, the ancient Egyptians tried to fortify themselves with as much magical protection as possible. The markings which cover the walls of their tombs aren't merely decorative, but have a definite practical purpose. Each image was intended to assist or protect the deceased on his journey to the next world. Perhaps most important, every Egyptian would want to be buried with the Book of the Dead, a series of spells, each designed to win a specific trial.
I'm in a room that's covered with texts from the Book of the Dead. Probably the most important spell that's in this room is chapter 125, which contains the negative confession, in which the deceased says that they are completely free of sin.
As with some modern religions, the ancient Egyptians believed that eternal life could only be achieved through purity of spirit. The last and most important test was a ceremony called the weighing of the heart. It was presided over by Osiris, the god of the dead. The heart of the deceased would be placed on a set of scales and balanced against a feather. The trial would only be completed if the feather was the heavier of the two.
Now, if the outcome was favorable, then he would pass into the next life, and this is without a doubt the culmination of the deceased's journey into the afterlife.
But it wasn't just about how he had lived his life. An ancient Egyptian nobleman could expect to receive all the help that came from a properly performed burial.
If you didn't have this help, say, for example, your body had not been mummified, or say you were not given the Book of the Dead, it would be a very difficult passage, and perhaps a passage that could not be made. So this is why the Egyptians provided people with everything that they needed to make this very difficult passage into the next life.
Unknown Man E was mummified, which the Egyptians believed would allow him to live on after death. But he was denied any of the protective magic, which would allow him to reach the next world. Many people believe that this was an intentional attempt to damn him.
When you examine the burial of Unknown Man E, there are certain factors that do suggest that he's been deliberately buried in a way which does him damage in the afterlife.
The first issue is identification. Ancient Egyptians believed that to reach the afterlife, a person's name must travel with him. Most of the occupants of the royal mummy cache had their names written on their coffins. But the coffin of Unknown Man E was completely bare. Not only that, the essential protective items normally placed inside the coffin were missing. Once a body has been mummified, amulets and a heart scarab were usually layered in its bandages. An Egyptian would also hope to be buried with shabti, small statuettes of himself and his servants, which would come alive and perform tasks for him in the afterlife. And most surprising of all, the sheep or goat skin found around the mummy of the Screaming Man may have been considered ritually impure by the ancient Egyptians. Its presence inside the coffin is highly unusual, and Dr. Hawass believes, damning.
The sign of hell in the mind of the ancient Egyptian was the goat skin. This goat skin is evidence, in my opinion, that he cannot go to the field of Iaro, paradise of ancient Egypt. He had to go to hell.
Citing Egyptian tradition, some experts have concluded that for the screaming man to be buried in this manner means that whoever he was must have died in disgrace. But what if he wasn't buried in the ancient Egyptian tradition? There is an alternate theory, which suggests that unknown man E's body was prepared by people who didn't fully understand the traditions of an Egyptian burial.
One way of accounting for a lot of the strange elements of this burial is that it wasn't actually a proper Egyptian burial at all. This is somebody abroad trying to imitate Egyptian techniques and doing the best with what they had.
As the Egyptian empire expanded, its people traveled more widely, coming into contact with other cultures. Officials would often be sent abroad to administer conquered territories.
When the mummy of unknown Mani was first examined by Fouquet and Maspero, they were struck by the horrific aspects of the mummy in the pose and the lack of name and so on. But there were aspects of it which suggested wealth and rank. For instance, he had, at that time, still golden earrings, and within the coffin there were staves or staffs, which are presumably signs of office, perfectly in accord with somebody of the kind of rank that would be maybe a foreign governor.
This might explain why the screaming man was buried in a sheep or goat skin. Although sacrilegious to ancient Egyptians, there's evidence that it was common in other societies. This limestone slab is inscribed with an ancient Egyptian text called the Tale of Sinhui. This story is about an Egyptian who receives a letter from the pharaoh urging him to return home to Egypt to avoid dying abroad and being buried in a sheepskin. Was the screaming man's body prepared as it was because he died abroad and was embalmed according to local custom? The animal skin wasn't the only anomaly. When the screaming man was first unwrapped, he was found to be covered in a paste made from quicklime, something that has never been found on any other Egyptian mummy. It suggests the work of someone who wasn't Egyptian. At the original autopsy, the Victorian examiners noticed another strange thing.
This paste also took on moisture from the air in the room, and the observers actually saw it expand in front of them, so it was quite a horrific sight.
The fact that it expanded posed a puzzle. There should have been enough water in the body to saturate it. So how could the paste still absorb moisture 3,000 years later? The only logical explanation is that before he was embalmed, unknown man E's body was already partially dried out. Egyptian methods of mummification evolved over time to become highly advanced. But the first successful attempts to preserve flesh were simple, as basic as burying a body in the sand. Dating from around 3,300 BC, this is thought to be the oldest mummy ever discovered in Egypt. The way in which it was dried was crude, but clearly effective. Over the course of about 10 years, the sand would have drawn out the body's moisture. Perhaps if unknown man E died abroad, the locals kept his body in sand as a means of temporary preservation.
This looks like somebody who's maybe been rough and readily dried out before the embalmers can properly get to it. Now that's the sort of thing that might occur had he died away from home.
The theory that the screaming man was an Egyptian living abroad is an attractive one, but it is still speculation. Next, Peter Brand is looking into one final theory. It begins with the death of one of the most famous pharaohs, Tutankhamun. And Dr. Hawass will try and put an end to more than 100 years of guesswork. Will he finally get some answers from the screaming man? The forensic examination of unknown man E is now underway. The heart of the investigation is a CT scan. This can give us a person's age at the time of death. It can reveal signs of disease and of any injuries sustained in life. A CT scan uses X-rays. It will capture more than 1,900 separate images to form a complete set of data. The scan itself takes minutes. The analysis of the data can take days. What Dr. Hawass and his team are hoping for is a clue, some hard evidence which will allow them finally to give unknown man E a name.
For the first time, that will bring this unknown man to the CAT scan machine. Because the CAT scan machine can reveal the magic of this man.
The data from the scan can be analyzed and turned into a perfect 3D image. It will enable experts to do something which until recently would have been impossible without dissecting and therefore destroying the mummy. They will see inside the body. And even if the scan can't tell us the screaming man's name, the data will allow the reconstruction team to rebuild his face. Caroline Wilkinson and her team are experts in the field. They work on contemporary forensic cases as well as ancient ones.
Well, the first thing really that facial reconstruction tells us is what the person looked like at the time around their death. We can also look to put people into populations, maybe geographically, sometimes nationally, to establish the ancestry group from which the individual came.
Finding out where the screaming man came from may be an essential piece of the puzzle. Some experts believe he was an Egyptian prince who died in disgrace. Others believe he was a governor whose body was brought home after he died abroad. But there's a third theory, which suggests he wasn't an Egyptian at all.
There is a suggestion that the unknown man was in fact not an Egyptian but a Hittite.
This theory pairs the evidence gleaned from the screaming man's burial with the story of a Hittite prince who is said to have died in Egypt. It seems extraordinary since for centuries, the Hittite Empire was one of Egypt's greatest enemies. Why would a member of a rival dynasty be buried like the screaming man among Egypt's greatest pharaohs? The story begins with the death of Tutankhamun. When he died, he left no heir. History says his widow, Ankhesenamun, turned to the Hittite king for help. Peter Brand is looking into the plausibility of this theory.
This is a photograph of a letter from the Hittite archives. When the pharaoh Tutankhamun died, his widow Ankhesenamun wrote to the Hittite king saying to him, "My husband has died and he has no sons, but you have many sons. Will you send one of your sons to marry me and he will become the king of Egypt?"
Every famous depiction of Egyptians and Hittites meeting shows a battle. They had even been at war during the reign of Tutankhamun's father. Given this history, it seems strange that Ankhesenamun would request a husband from the Hittite court.
Imagine if during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had died and Jackie Kennedy wrote to the Khrushchev and said, "Send me one of your sons, he'll become president of the United States." It's very unlikely the American people would have accepted that. It's even more unlikely that the Egyptians would have accepted a foreigner to become pharaoh.
The letters show that the Hittite king sent an envoy to verify Ankhesenamun's good faith. When he returned, he brought with him another letter, insisting the Egyptian queen's request was genuine.
Well, this second letter seems to have convinced the Hittite king, and so he dispatched one of his sons, a man named Zenanza, in the hope that this would end the war between Egypt and the Hittites and bring a permanent peace and alliance.
But Zenanza never made it to marry Ankhesenamun. The records tell us he died before he reached the Egyptian royal court at Thebes.
It's very clear that the Hittites believed that Zenanza had been murdered, but it's also possible that he died for some other reason, perhaps from a plague that was ravaging the ancient Near East at that time, or perhaps from an accident, or they could have been attacked by bandits.
The story says that the enraged king, grieving for his son, immediately ordered an attack on Egypt. At this point, any hope of peace between the two nations seemed lost.
Now the idea is that if this prince had reached Egypt and then died, that his body could not be sent back to his homeland because the Hittites and the Egyptians were then at war.
We don't know for sure who first connected unknown man E with the story of the Hittite prince. While the theory can be made to fit the facts, it does seem a little far-fetched. Is there any physical evidence to connect this story to unknown man E? The scan data has been used to build a 3D model of his skull, accurate to within fractions of a millimeter. This is the first stage of the reconstruction. The second is to start work on the face.
He's got this so-called scream. The first thing that we do is to close the mouth. So we reset the lower jaw back into the natural position of the mouth at rest.
Once the skull is prepared, markers are placed on the image. They act as a guide to how thick the flesh should be.
The majority of the face shape and form is taken from the muscle structure. So each of the muscles of the face are modelled one by one onto the skull.
The dimensions of each muscle are dictated by measurements taken from different parts of the skull. Despite the fact that its cartilage decayed centuries ago, Caroline can determine the size, shape, and proportions of the nose.
So the final part of the reconstruction is to put the skin layer in place over the top of the muscle structure.
The skin color and details have yet to be added, but this is an image of the face of unknown man E. In the shape of his head, Caroline sees evidence which may narrow down our ideas of who he could be. Previous reconstructions show the skulls of ancient Egyptians share certain characteristics. They have similar shape and proportions. Caroline sees the same traits in this skull.
The most noticeable thing about the screaming mummy are his long lower face proportions. So he has long distances between his nose and his mouth and his mouth and his chin. And this is something that I've seen in other ancient Egyptians, and also the long cranium from forehead to the back of the head. And we can often see an indentation on the top of the skull called a post-spragmatic depression. I don't see anything in this particular skull that suggests he wasn't ancient Egyptian.
Caroline's hunch, based on 15 years of experience, is that this is the skull of an ancient Egyptian. If it's right, it may be possible to discount the theory that unknown man E was the Hittite prince. This would mean that just two theories remain: the official whose body was returned to Egypt after he died, or Pentawere, the would-be pharaoh who died in disgrace. Can our investigation finally prove whether either of these is the screaming man? The mummy of unknown man E is undergoing forensic examination in the hope it might tell us more about who he was and how he died. By analyzing data from the CT scan, Dr. Ashraf Salem is able to see inside the body. As well as looking for clues to the mummy's identity, he's particularly interested in finding any hidden evidence of injury or disease, something which might finally point toward a cause of death. Looking at the results, he's able to say roughly how old the screaming man was when he died.
What I can say about this mummy, number one, is the age. And I would assume between 25 till 40 years of age.
This estimate is based on a number of factors, like the condition of key joints and the appearance of the teeth. Until now, most people believed that the screaming man died young. As Dr. Salem works his way through the images, something else soon becomes apparent.
The second point is that we also could not find organs inside the body.
In the original autopsy report, Dr. Fouquet stated categorically that the organs were still present within unknown man E's body. But evidence from the CT scan suggests that this may not be the case at all.
Well, This is strange. The mummy has no organs present in the abdomen. I just cannot believe that Fouquet thought he saw something which wasn't there.
Dylan has spent more than 10 years studying the case of unknown man E. Like everyone else for the last century, he has been basing his investigations on the autopsy report of 1886. The new revelations from the scans suggest the autopsy can't be relied upon. The new data allows Dr. Salem to closely examine the skeleton of unknown man E, and he has noticed another surprising fact.
What's astonishing in this mummy is that the rib cage, all the thoracic cage, is intact. We don't have a single fracture, and this is very unique.
Most of the other mummies Dr. Salem has examined show clear evidence of fractures, occurring either because of the embalming process or because of rough handling of the bodies after death. Unknown man E has no broken bones. Even for a royal mummy, this is highly unusual. His body must have been treated with great care, even reverence. Coupled with the fact that he was discovered lying among the pharaohs, this evidence strongly suggests he was royal. It now seems the screaming man was probably older than first thought, the correct age to have been the adult son of Ramses III. For Dr. Hawass, all this evidence makes the foreign governor theory less likely. For him, it all points clearly toward the harem conspiracy.
The evidence from the CAT scan now suggests that this could be the mummy of Bentaur, the son of Ramses III.
And Dr. Hawass believes that the final piece of evidence that unknown man E was Pentawere can still be found on the mummy.
The other thing that supports my theory is actually the goat skin. To cover this mummy with a goat skin, it shows that this man cannot go to paradise.
The only evidence we have of Pentawere is the papyrus, which tells us he was allowed to commit suicide, probably by poisoning. The absence of the screaming man's organs means it is impossible to test them. But do the CT results suggest any other cause of death?
I couldn't find any cause for the death of this mummy.
The final part of the investigation is to study unknown man E's skull. Can the scan results explain the mummy's haunting expression? Since Victorian times, people have speculated on what could have caused unknown man E's scream. Early students of the mummy believed he had died screaming. Later academics said it was the result of poor mummification or of the facial tissues settling over the centuries. Dr. Salem returns to the idea that the mummy's scream began at the time of death.
When we find a mummy with a half-opened mouth, this means that this mummy died while the mouth was opened in such a way, and nobody cared or nobody was there just to close the mouth. So it stayed as it was before death.
But while examining the head, Dr. Salem notices a light gray area in the images from the scan. This indicates there's brain matter remaining inside the skull. Mummification in Egypt evolved over the course of 3,000 years, but it was only around 1,200 BC that they began to routinely remove the brain, typically by fracturing the skull and extracting it through the nasal cavity. Ramses III died around 1,155 BC. So if unknown man E was his son, then his brain should have been extracted during mummification. The theory that the screaming man was Pentawere is not a perfect one. There are still certain anomalies.
There are a lot of strange things still here. We've answered some questions and shown some things to be more ordinary than we thought, but other things to be much, much stranger.
Aspects of unknown man E's burial continue to defy explanation. To enter the afterlife, a man's identity had to live on in this world. If those who buried him intended to damn him, their attempts have, in a sense, been thwarted. We can give him back part of that identity. We can't restore his name. We don't have final proof that this is Pentawere, but we can restore his face. Facial anthropologists have now recreated his skull. Individual muscles have been molded into place. His skin has been restored. This is the face that in death took on a scream. The face of the screaming man.
And I do believe that after this investigation, I'm really sure that the unknown man is not unknown anymore.